Thank you for joining us today for Jennifer Strauss and Associates in our Webinar Wednesday program. We are coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday and are provided complimentary. They are recorded and can be downloaded from our website and YouTube channel, which now holds over 400 of our government contracting webinars. In the interest of time, we do not take questions, so if you have questions for our speaker, we will have his information on the last slide of the presentation today. And a special thanks to our educational sponsor, the National Veterans Small Business Coalition, for making these webinars possible. The NVSBC is the largest nonprofit trade association for veterans. Please visit their website for more information. Okay, and now a little bit about us. We work with U.S. federal government contractors, including product, service, and software firms. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance. More information is on our website. We also have opportunities for your organization to advertise in our newsletter. We now reach over 21,100 subscribers, and this includes both contractors and government. Contact us for pricing information with the email shown on the screen. As noted, we have over 400 webinars in our archives. As we continue to educate federal contractors, I would like to bring your attention to our webinar schedule for 2021. The full schedule and speakers are all confirmed. First up is a monthly series called the GovCon Live Q&A Cafe. This is a live webinar series held each month. These will take place on the second Friday of each month in 2021 at 12 p.m. Eastern. We have assembled a group of 4 panelists who are subject matter experts on a specific federal contracting topic. The panelists will make a short presentation about the topics listed here on your screen and then take your live questions about that topic. So for example, January will kick off with our panelists covering CMMC on Friday, January 8th. Our panelists include attorneys, consultants, and other industry professionals. You can sign up on our website under the Q&A Cafe tab. Sponsorships are available, and you can email hello@jenniferstrauss.com for a media kit with pricing details. Okay, and in our second webinar series in 2021, we will be covering each part of the DFARS, or Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations. Similar to our current FAR series, this will be a weekly series dedicated to defense contracting, its rules, and specific regulations. This series is complimentary as well and will be held on Wednesdays at 12 p.m. Eastern. We will run through the parts sequentially, which means that we'll start the year with DFARS Part 201 and finish with Part 252 at the end of the year. You can sign up on our website under the DFAR tab. And again, sponsorships are available, and you can email hello@jenniferstrauss.com for a media kit with pricing details. And now to introduce our speaker, Eric Crucius. Welcome, Eric. We are glad to have you here with us today, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Great, thank you, Hunter, and I presume you can hear me. So really good to be here. I like doing these kinds of presentations that kind of talk about the business of government contracting. I always try to view being a government contracts lawyer as not a cost center, but as an ability to kind of help clients through problems and increase revenue and increase profitability in the end. And I think what I've tried to do is kind of talk about those opportunities that are out there, obviously the risks that are out there too. But you know, I've aimed this presentation at folks who can appreciate the fact that you know, there's a lot of different things that lawyers can do. One of them is to not just tell you what you can't do, but also kind of explain the possibilities in using the regulations to show those possibilities. So, Hunter, if you don't mind going to the next slide. This is that's our title and our date. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. That's our kind of our agenda for today as we're together over the next half hour or so. We have new regulations that consolidate the mentor or protege programs, and I thought I'd touch on that because there's something that I've gotten concern calls from clients about. So we'll give an overview of that because I think it's germane to this topic. Then we'll go kind of through from a high level what set-asides are, when, where, and how. We'll get into some details. Hopefully, whether you're a beginner or an expert in this area, you'll get something out of this. And then we'll talk about kind of vets first and other requirements that are out there regarding set-aside. So if you're an owner of one of those types of businesses, you could take advantage of that. And then I always like doing a top list. I actually had this fashioned as a top 5, and I didn't have the heart to eliminate one of them. So now it turned into a top 6 kind of small business blunders, things that lessons learned that can be avoided. So let's go to the next slide. We're going to first talk about here the new regulations that consolidate the mentor-protege programs. Next slide. So this rule came out, it's a final rule. It came out, I guess, about a week and change ago, and a week and a half ago. And it's one of the most dramatic rules that we've seen in the small business arena in some time. And it wasn't unexpected, because it went through the rulemaking process, but it's still has the impact to potentially change how small businesses and large businesses do business with the federal government. So the first thing it does is it consolidates the 2 mentor-protege programs, the 8A program as well as the all-small mentor-protege program into one. And there's 2 kind of practical effects of that. One is for this program, you don't have a limit on how many opportunities you can go ahead and pursue and win. Where it was limited to 3 over 2 years, you still have that 2-year time limit, but it's still it's not limited to 3. Another is for a JV agreement, the 8A folks used to have to send those in for approval, mentor-protege to approval for the SBA, and that's not the case anymore. You could self-certify just like in the all-small mentor-protege program. So I think that's an important step where you don't have to go get those JVs approved. Hopefully, save on attorney's fees and the like in that process. So it makes it much easier for businesses. Also, I want to just mention about the JVs. There's been a general requirement that they have to be unpopulated. That's still the case. But there is a permissible, it is permissive to have some administrative personnel in those JVs, such as folks who are facility security officers. But in general, the JV should be unpopulated, no matter which kind of business you own, whether it's an 8A or a small business or something else. So, that's another point of just about the consolidation of the 2 programs. Also, if you look at multiple award contracts, the size standard will be assigned now at the task order level. And so that way, you have the ability to kind of have multiple different NAICS codes and size standards throughout the life of a contract. It could mean that, business that could have pursued opportunities before under a particular NAICS code can't now if it's being awarded at the task order level. So that'll be interesting to watch, see how that plays out, but that's another kind of new requirement that's out there. We also have with M&A and pending proposals, this has always been kind of a sticky wicket. What happens, if a small business is purchased by a large business and they have irons in the fire, they have proposals out there. So, there's a new rule now for contractors where a merger of an acquisition causes the firm's size status to change after proposal submission but prior to award. In the past, SBA required recertification if there was M&A activity up until the time of award. So if you had a proposal in and became large, you'd have to recertify. But now, SBA sees that with protests happening, and it's not my fault, even though I file them sometimes, but with protests happening, sometimes these awards take a while. There could be a lag time. So if the M&A activity takes place more than 180 days after proposal submission, award can still occur to that small business. The downside is, though, the agency cannot take credit for setting aside that work. Another nuance there, these rules are 55 pages long, single space, triple column. So I think a lot of folks, including me, even though I've read through them a couple of times, are still unpacking what they all mean. And of course, ANCs and Native Hawaiian organizations have their own rules and regulations. There was an important clarification, because I think this has been a kind of this has been an area of uncertainty, for lack of a better term. But advanced SBA approval is not required for ANC certification when the subsidiary's ownership changes. So I think that's also important. It makes things a little bit easier. Only instead of certification, just notice is required. So you don't need to kind of get that certification in advance. So I think, as a whole, these rules generally make things a little bit easier for companies, but there are some nuances with recertifications that I'm currently trying to put together a chart for some clients actually about when recertifications must occur, because it's really a bouncing ball and it's a little bit difficult to follow. If you do a search, which I did the other day, just for the word recertify or recertification in the rule, I think there's like 140 mentions of it throughout the rule itself. And, trying to untangle under the various circumstances that you could potentially have when recertification is required, it was never easy. And I think this rule does not make it any easier. So we'll have to see how that all kind of bears out as this rule is tested and interpreted through small size standard protests and things like that. So we'll be closely monitoring that. But I would, if you're in the small business world and if you're an 8A contractor as well, this is something to pay attention to. Let's go to the next slide. So this next slide is just going to have a few basic things about kind of set-asides, when, where, and how. Let's go to the next slide. And this is kind of one of my small business blunders, but so I'll talk about it a little bit more later. But you don't want to lead if you're kind of engaging with an agency and trying to convince them that you're a good business partner for them and you want to sell to them. You don't lead with your certifications, right? I'm a small business. I'm an SDVOSB. I'm a WSB, 8 HubZone, whatever it is. You lead with your capabilities, and then you say, oh, and by the way, I am a X. I have an X SetAsides, certification. So that way, they want to know kind of how you can help them, and the fact that you're a small business is a bonus. There are certain circumstances, though, when the agencies have discretion to set aside work. There's some circumstances where they have, there's mandatory set-asides. So when, for over 150,000, if the agency is convinced that there are 2 small businesses that can perform the work at a fair price, they do the market research and all that stuff, then that's supposed to be set aside. Even if there's just one, they can possibly justify it. To that end, if an award is over $700,000 and it's not set aside, then that large contractor or even small contractor must have a small business set-aside plan. So contractors that have those plans will be looking to small businesses to kind of fulfill their obligations under the small business subcontracting plan. And it goes back to kind of engaging with the agency and talking to them. They don't know oftentimes all the small businesses that are out there that are capable of performing the work they're putting out to bid. I've seen it too many times where a bid comes out, it's not it's unrestricted, and a few small businesses come along and say, we could have done this, you should have set it aside, and the agencies has no idea. So selling the capabilities to the agency is important, because that helps kind of fulfill the agency's mandate to set aside certain work, when they have those 2 small businesses and the work is over $150,000. I will caution, though, when you look at products, the sale of products out there, that's a little bit more complicated. It's harder to find small businesses that can manufacture. You have this non-manufacturer rule that requires the small business to actually do the manufacturing of the products that are being sold to the government. That being said, there are waivers, prevalence waivers actually, throughout. So a small business may still be able to provide the goods even if they're not manufacturing under one of those waivers. They're really pretty broad, the waivers. Until you need them and you can't get them, then they're not quite as broad as you'd like. So kind of something to think about there. If something is set aside, of course, for a company that's a small business, that small business must perform at least 50% in the services realm of the personnel cost, or 50% of the manufacturing cost, not including the cost of supplies. So in those circumstances, you have, the small business actually has to be a real company that can perform the work. They've gotten the set aside. That's great. That's only half the battle, right? The good news is I've got, the old joke, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is we won the award. The bad news is we won the award because sometimes it's a lot easier to capture the work than it is to actually perform the work and do a job that the agency appreciates. So you need to approach the agency, make that business case that, not just us, but there are these other companies there that can perform the set aside work. We can do it really well. So, you should do that. Of course, there are large businesses out there that are trying to make the opposite case. We're much safer. You say you could perform, a small business can perform this work, but they don't have the capabilities of doing X, Y, and Z. So, as a small business, you have to show that, you kind of pre-butt those allegations, those general allegations that could be made, and just talk about how capable you are and how, all these other agencies have been really happy with you performing a similar kind of work. You can get there. And I just want to touch on the role of protests. Obviously, in the small business space, protests are fairly prevalent. You not just have the protests to GAO that everyone kind of knows about, but you also have these size protests, which can be brought on based on a number of grounds. But protests, that the awardee is not under the size standard for whatever reason, maybe affiliation or something else, or maybe they have certified their size status, but that certification is incorrect because they won, $1 billion worth of work over the last 3 years or 5 years. So that's also important to keep a lookout for, where sometimes erroneously or on purpose a business will certify that they're small when they're not. And those protests play an important role in kind of weeding that out. Of course, they can gum up the process a little bit if you get just kind of these laser shot protests across the transom where the disappointed bidder is trying to kind of figure out any way to kind of mess up the award. And so based on suspicion, they bring some kind of protest, and that requires the small business to sometimes hire a lawyer and respond, or just produce a ton of documents to the SBA to look at and resolve the protest. So just something to think about there. Let's go to the next slide. And really, this is like a 5-hour webinar. I'm trying to kind of cover it from a very high level. So you can kind of get a taste of anything. And then if you have further detailed questions, you could reach out. Vets first and other requirements. Let's go to the next slide. So there are kind of some particular rules. I'll just touch on a couple of them, just for your edification. 2 that are the most prevalent, I would think. Vets first essentially requires, if there are 2 veteran-owned small businesses that can perform the work from the VA, that they are provided an opportunity to bid on it and it's set aside for them. I'm often surprised how the VA is kind of not willing or not liking the use of Vets First, and tries to find ways to justify the non-use of Vets First. And that's anecdotal, just on cases that I've handled and clients I've helped. But that's again goes to the unfortunately, sometimes that contractor has to make that affirmative sale that says, hey, we can do this. There are others that can do this too. This needs to be set aside under Vets First. This Vets First has been litigated a number of times, all the way up to the Supreme Court, a few years ago with Kingdomware, which I'm sure anyone on this call is familiar with. That's another case where the VA did not want to, set aside or didn't feel obligated to continue the use of set-asides under Vets First. But it's a powerful tool, and veteran-owned businesses should not be afraid to use it because it's mandatory. It's a mandatory set-aside if there are 2 folks who can do it. So, I wanted to skip down to the 8A realm too. the sale that's made there to agencies is that, the agencies have a lot of discretion, especially for small awards under $4 million, to award sole source contracts to 8A companies. And there's little justification that has to happen. I don't have the reg in here, but if you're an 8A company and want to write this down, it's 13 CFR 124.506. And so if you have an award of less than $4 million, there's no obligation to compete it. It can be sole source award. Now, after above $4 million, there is some justification that has to happen. But, that's an opportunity for a small business, an 8A business, to go into the agency, say, I offer this unique product or service, or I can help you with this unique problem you have. And all of a sudden, you get a pretty sizable contract to do that. So, there are other bases, not just that, to get a sole source award, but those are the general bases. For instance, there's only one source, or there's an unusual or compelling urgency, or it's in the public interest. These are all things that have to be publicly justified. But in the 8A program, you kind of have a little bit more discretion where the agency can just, award these relatively smaller contracts, although there still could be a good size, especially for an 8A company, to perform that work. So, that's something to look at if you're an 8A company. And then with other set-asides, there are set-asides for WSBs, hub zones, so kind of, be on the lookout for opportunities where if you offer a unique product or service, you could say, I'm a hub zone. That's oftentimes hub zone is the hardest of the set-asides to kind of get competition on. But, with the new hub zone regulations that came out about, this year it seemed like 10 years, so I'm not often sure. I think it was about a year ago. That made it easier in some respects to maintain a hub zone status based on where the employees were located. So there may be more success in hub zones keeping their hub zone status, but oftentimes that's a category that agencies have trouble fulfilling. So if you're a hub zone, going out there and showing your unique capabilities to the agency can be really helpful along the way. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is I would think the most interesting part of this presentation about the small business blunders. So let's go to the next one. And we've already kind of discussed this first point here, selling the business sides before the capabilities. I've heard this from government officials more times than I could count with my shoes off. So quite a few times, dozens of times. They want to hear about what you can do before they hear about your size status. Of course, the size status and your socioeconomic status is important to them, but they're there to get a mission accomplished. So they want to know how a small business can accomplish that mission and do it well with low risk. And the fact that you're a small business is a great add-on. It can really be helpful in essentially ensuring that they meet their size standards and things like that. And a lot of government officials want to help small business along. So I think, that's an important part of the conversation, but the important lead there is, here's a problem you have, and here's how we can help you solve that problem. Oh, and by the way, I'm an SDVOSB. And all of a sudden, that's just sounds really great to them if in fact you could do those things. So just along the way, just something to think about when you make your sales calls. I've also heard that from a number of government officials, they just don't want your kind of general marketing. They like the marketing to be tailored to what they're trying to accomplish. That's easier said than done, I realize that, but just something I've heard as well. So certainly lead with what you can do and how you can do it, and the uniqueness that you bring to a problem and the low risk you bring to a contract. And then, on top of that, if you have a socioeconomic status that they can help them check a box with, that's even the better. But don't just go and say, I'm an SDVOSB, and then say down the road what you can do to help them. So that's just a suggestion just from talking and hearing from a number of government officials about it. Let's go to the next slide. This is something I've seen more of in recent years than I wish I had, bundling. And for those who are unfamiliar, bundling is when the government takes a number of different tasks that have been in separate contracts and kind of bundles them into one larger contract. And oftentimes when that happens, it leaves kind of the realm of small business because there aren't multiple businesses who could perform this larger requirement. And so the key there is there's a couple of things to think about with bundling, because once a contract is bundled, it's usually too late. We have the ability, and sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to file a pre-award protest and say that the bundling is unlawful or unnecessary. But it's not too hard for an agency, because they're given so much discretion when you bring a protest. It's not too hard for the agency to make some kind of cognizant argument that the bundling was necessary along the way. And there are certain metrics they're supposed to hit, and there's certain ways they're supposed to justify it in their internal documentation. And they don't always do that. And that's where you get the success with the bundling argument. But before that ever happens, of course, making the argument or just kind of talking to the agency about how, this is suited, the way the contract is kind of split out into multiple contracts is best for the agency, or it's at least it's not advantageous to bundle it together, and kind of talking to potential customers why that bundling would be a bad idea. Maybe the customer will lose innovation that the small businesses bring if it's just with one large company. Those kinds of talking points. All of this is a long-term play, right? It's in our society, we're sometimes a little bit too reactive, or don't think about those things until it's too late. So with the bundling issue, that's a long-term play where having contact with the agency, explaining why the multiple contracts is a better way to go, that kind of thing. Of course, there are always rules about when you can talk to agency officials when it's a procurement on the street and things like that. So you want to be careful about those rules and requirements, and don't want to be seeming like you're influencing an open procurement or having discussions with an agency when there's no discussions for the other parties. But kind of helping shape that narrative that the procurement as it is best left alone and shouldn't be bundled, I think is an important step to take. Once it gets to me, it's a lot, like I said, a lot of times it's too late to kind of avoid that issue, unless there's the lack of legal justification for what they did. Let's go to the next slide. This third point, I think, is one that I've seen a lot of protests kind of address, and that's of affiliation. Have to think about these affiliation issues along the way. It's and that's where those joint venture agreements and working with a mentor protege or mentor or a protege can really help, because you could avoid some of those affiliation issues. A mentor protege agreement will not cure other affiliation issues. So if there's an affiliation problem and then you enter into some kind of mentor protege agreement, it's not going to solve that problem that is already there, but it'll solve the problem of you want to work closer with the business and do certain things. It allows you to do that. Aside from that, though, there are a number of things that can trigger affiliation, common ownership, familial relationship, and these things are all rebuttable. But it's important to kind of think about, as you're taking these steps, if I do X with this company, is it going to create an affiliation issue? And even if it's not technically incorrect or would not trigger an affiliation issue, how does it look? I had one case once where there was a common address, and the two companies worked and had offices in the same building, and it was actually nothing more than that. It just happened that they were working in a somewhat smaller town, and there were a couple of office buildings, and that's just the way where they wound up being. But it turned into this protest that had to be rebutted to show that there was no issue with that and that they were able to do that. So all those kinds of things can kind of create not necessarily presumption, but create enough of an issue where you have to respond to it and show that there's independence there and there's not affiliation. Because if there is affiliation, of course, you have to add the employees or the or revenue together, and then you may go out of the realm of a small business. I had one recently where there clearly was affiliation between the two companies, but even when you added them together, they were still under the size standard that was required, and it was by quite a big margin. So affiliation can really be something that trips up companies, and I've seen it happen too many times. So just take care in what you're doing to make sure that it doesn't create an affiliation issue. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the thing about government contracts is it's always changing. So there are new regulations that are issued on seemingly weekly basis that can have dramatic impacts about what a company can or should do or can't or shouldn't do. And knowing what these regulations are can seem like a daunting task. But thank goodness we live in an age now with easy access to the internet and resources and really complementary resources. And I have a slide and a couple of slides just about that. But understanding kind of what those are important. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One is, of course, the Chinese telecom rule, Section 889 of the NDAA a couple of years ago banned the provision of certain Chinese telecom to the federal government and surveillance equipment. And now in August of this year, the rule was updated to include possession of that equipment, whether or not it was connected with the company's operations that work towards providing goods or services to the federal government. So if you have a larger company and you have a small piece that does federal government contract work, and you have the banned equipment in a plant halfway around the world, if it's the same offering entity, then that's a problem. And there's another one, CMMC and the new regulations concerning compliance with NIST Special Publication 800-171 if the contractor possesses controlled unclassified information, CUI. These are kind of important rules that have come out, and it's easy, not to mention the small business rule that came out a week and a half ago, we've already discussed from a very high level. It's very easy to kind of lose sight of these things, and all of a sudden you walk into a problem that you didn't know you had because regulations have changed. So it's kind of understanding those regulations, reading your contracts, reading the solicitations. It's easy to gloss over all those clauses that are in a solicitation, right? The FAR, the DoD contract, the DFARS, or another agency's separate regulations, and just kind of say, this is standard form, I'll move on. But first of all, you'd be surprised sometimes the wrong regulations are in a solicitation. So you want to get those out so you don't have to comply with them. And sometimes things are in there that you wouldn't expect, even if it's permissible to be in there. And you've signed up to obligate yourself to do something that you wouldn't or shouldn't have to do, or you can't do. So kind of staying abreast of the regulations, how they can be placed into contracts. I'll give one final example. The Trump administration issued an executive order a few weeks back on racial sensitivity training. That executive order, as it's written, does not require the execution of regulations to apply. So you could see starting at the end of November when it takes effect that it is potentially that regulation, that executive order, I should say, could find itself in contracts and subcontracts. Even so, DOL, their agency, OFCCP, held a webinar or a call last week and talked about how even though it doesn't take effect until the end of November, they're still receiving complaints and they're going to still analyze those complaints. This is a kind of a fast-moving area, so reading the contract and understanding what your obligations are is the most important thing, because for the most part, not always, but for the most part, there are very few obligations the government contractor has outside their contract. So reviewing the contract and knowing what is necessary and kind of keeping abreast of those developments is important. Let's go to the next slide. So choosing teaming partners carefully. We see it so much, and I'm sure folks on the phone have seen it too, that teaming partners, sometimes it doesn't always work out well in the end. But we have to, if you're a small business prime contractor, you're going to be largely responsible for what your subcontractor does. The government has taken pains the last 5-10 years to really put the onus on the prime contractor to ensure compliance with various rules and regulations from their subcontractors. And that's why it's important to slow things down. But B, it's even more important to kind of know who your business partners are. As I say in the slide, it's really like a marriage. Having that intimate familiarity with the other company and having the confidence that they can do the work and that they'll do it in a compliant way is of the paramount importance, especially these days. And if you're a subcontractor, it's important because you don't want you want to be used to get a contract, and then you're excluded from the team once the contract is awarded. So, kind of ensuring that in your agreements with them is important, A, but B, just ensuring that you're working with the right people who wouldn't do something like that purposefully to another company, that they have the moral compass, so to speak, in order to avoid things like that from happening. Knowing kind of these things and knowing other companies out there who can have complementary services or products you can work with, having deep familiarity with their qualifications, so when it's time to put in the proposal, it's going to look good and it's going to hit all the points that it should hit. And then the last point here, of course, is you want to carefully review the documents you have entered into with that other company. It all starts usually with an NDA and a teaming agreement, non-disclosure agreement, and a teaming agreement. The enforceability of teaming agreements is kind of in flux. It's usually pretty hard to enforce them, although there are some exceptions to that. But you still want to carefully review them, and you want to have some kind of obligation in there that the prime, if you're the sub, will use you on the work that you're helping put together the bid for. And the subcontract is very important, of course, we'll deal with work share and the rights and responsibilities that everyone has. And, a couple points, does the prime have the right to terminate the sub for convenience? Usually the middle ground there is only if the government terminates that work for convenience. But you don't want to be caught as a subcontractor in the position where they find somebody else they like better, or could do it for a lower price. So they terminate the subcontract for convenience and bring in another subcontractor to do the same work. Those kinds of things are all those trapdoors that are in these kinds of agreements. It's important to kind of have a lawyer look at them. But you can use this to your business advantage, right? You have these solid agreements with business partners that you trust and you like working with. That can really be a way to help grow business in the end. Let's go to the next slide. And this is the last substantive slide we have, number 6, staying abreast of recent developments. I kind of alluded to this in the earlier slide, but it bears repeating. Because we have access to the internet, we're in a far greater position than we have been in the past, where you can find out the latest and greatest of what's going on just by not even leaving your office, right? Or leaving your home office in these days especially. And there are a ton of public websites that have information, law firm blogs, industry organizations. They pump out all this information for free. Of course, when you read it, you have to verify it before you take action that relies on that. You probably want to read multiple sources or read the source of the regulations yourself. But new regulations are posted on the Federal Register every day. They have a public inspection preview the day before. So there's ample opportunity to kind of review these things and get up to speed. Of course, you want to read the contract and solicitation to make sure that you feel comfortable with what's in there. But I would highly recommend doing things like this, like you're listening to this webinar and finding other similar webinars out there, subscribing to blogs, by law firms, accountants, and consultants. And I would highly recommend kind of joining government contracting industry organizations. And this is a great way to kind of help expand your business, because you can meet other folks who maybe have been working on an opportunity with an agency and they need somebody who does X, and you happen to do X, and now all of a sudden you're part of the team. And just a few off the top of my head, NCMA, National Contract Management Association, that's an association of contracting professionals. The thing I like about NCMA is you really network with folks who are in the government if you're in industry, and you kind of learn about how the other side, for lack of a better term, thinks, and it's a really great way to kind of hash out how contracting works. CCAF, Small Emerging Contractor Advisory Forum, is really great because it's filled with small businesses who you can network with. I mean, it was easier to do pre-pandemic, but they still have programs that are aimed at small businesses and are only for small businesses, only for contractors. So service providers like me can't participate, so you won't get harassed by an accountant or a lawyer or something, or a banker. And then Professional Services Council, if you do services, it's a great organization. They do a lot of educational work, and they're very active. So I'd recommend that one too. And then there are others out there as well that I haven't mentioned, but I think kind of networking within the community is really helpful in kind of developing business as a small business along the way. Next slide. And I think with that, I'm turning it back over to my gracious host. I really appreciate everyone listening for a few minutes. If you have some follow-up questions, feel free to reach out via my contact information right there.
Thank you, Eric, for a great presentation and sharing your time with us today. And thanks to everyone who joined us for this webinar. The recording will be on our website and YouTube channel within the next 24 hours, so make sure to look out for that. And please join us this Friday as we cover each part of the FAR, and join us next Wednesday for more hot topics in federal contracting.